Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so last week we stopped at time periods. We looked at the time periods for the buyer, right? Their contingency periods, how long they have to review documents and do their investigations and inspections, the time they have access to the property. We talked about all of that stuff. What we're going to talk about today is paragraph 3L8, which is the sale of buyer's property. So let me share my screen so you guys can see that. And that's what you should be looking at right now, is that page of the purchase agreement. And right here is paragraph 3L8, sale of buyer's property. Okay. So when a buyer is contingent on selling a property to buy a property, we have to make sure that we're checking this box, because it says sale of buyer's property is not a contingency unless checked here, which is we're incorporating CAR form COP. And so since that's really the biggest part of this contingency, that's what I wanted to talk about. So I am going to show you guys a COP. So this is a COP. Now, the COP used to be kind of the all-encompassing. It was the contingency for sale of buyer's property or purchase of a replacement property, right? The seller used this form too. It was combined into one. They split them up. So they made the COP for the buyers. They made the SPRP, which is seller's purchase of replacement property, a new separate form. So now this is solely about the buyer has a property that they need to sell, and the purchase of this one, this purchase agreement that we're writing, is contingent upon that. Okay. So by default, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement. There's no other reason to change it unless we're adding it maybe to a counter. And then we want to put on there that it's the other and it's, seller's multiple counter, number 2, number 1, whatever that is. Okay. This date right here is the date of this purchase agreement, right? So if I wrote the purchase agreement today, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement dated June 1st, 2023. This is the property address. That's the seller's property. This is the buyer's name, which is the person that's writing the offer. And this is the seller's name. This here, buyer's property, is the property I'm selling that is creating the contingency of sale for this upleg I'm writing the offer on. Okay. Any questions so far? I want you guys to stop me if anything gets confusing. Please throw up a hand. I'll keep checking the participants or the chat. Just let me know, okay? Because I want you guys to understand this, because what's happening is that this is contingent sales are probably the most common. If you look at the amount of sales that have to be done, contingent sales become, whether it's a contingency from the seller side or it's a contingency on the buyer side, their contingent sales are a majority of the transactions that we're doing. Okay. So let's look at paragraph 1, which is the buyer's property contingency. This agreement is contingent upon, by default, A, buyer entering into a contract of the sale of and closing escrow on buyer's property. Okay. So the default is I have to get into contract and I have to close escrow. If you are a buyer's agent that is representing a buyer that is contingent on selling a property, meaning either you had the listing or they were listed with somebody else and now you're representing them on the buyer side, and they have to sell the property, you should not be, in the majority of cases, you should not be writing offers or showing property until you've already got that down leg, and that's what we'll call the home they're selling, that down leg into escrow. The reason for that is, and this is one of the things that I talk about a lot in our contracts, is the strength of your offer. If you're trying to write an offer on a property in a market that exists today where inventory is low, homes that are priced properly are still selling quickly, they still have multiple offers. If you're trying to jump into that fray of multiple offers, and then you have to add on top, but we still got to sell the other place, you're putting yourself at the back of the line for all offers. the majority of time when a buyer who has not already entered escrow on their down leg property, the home they must sell, and they're contingent on that sale for the purchase of this new property, the up leg, the majority of the time when they get their offer accepted prior to putting their own home into escrow is because the house they're writing the offer on is overpriced, has been sitting on the market, and isn't getting offers because the seller's unrealistic. And ultimately, the buyer ends up writing an offer at this overpriced, unrealistic list price. Okay. So that's what happens. If I give myself an opportunity to want to compete with those realistically priced houses that are going to sell in a normal amount of time, that I've already got to put my home in escrow. Okay. It's that has to be 90% of the time, that has to be the way you go. There's going to be some things that pop up, obviously, where you need to do it prior in order to, get the listing and get them into the market looking as home buyers. Excuse me. But for best service, right, to the customer and for the highest level of success, we've got to get that house into escrow first. And that goes back to them too, is like saying, hey, listen, you want to be a homeowner, like you want to change from this home to your other dream home, whatever that change is, whatever that exchange ultimately becomes. You've also got to be motivated and realistic on your list price. And so, pushing them into the idea of listing it for the right price, right? All of these things get combined together, is that I have to get them right on the down leg that they're going to sell so that I can make everything work for them properly on their up leg on the purchase. Right. So those two things go hand in hand. So I have to use them together. Right. And so as long as I'm doing the right things on both sides, then I should have a smoother transaction. Right. And so what we're going to do is by putting them in escrow first on their down leg, we make their offer stronger, but it also creates a higher level of motivation in that buyer that was a seller, right? Because now they feel like we've got to find something that works because we're already in escrow, right? It's not this nebulous, let's keep looking. That's not the right one. We got to find the right one. They're more motivated. They're more likely to be ready to write offers and find a house that makes sense for them. Okay. So the default is I have to enter into a contract for sale and I have to close escrow. So the reason that makes you less powerful as an offer for a buyer is because now not only do I have to take my house off the market for everybody else, but I have to wait for you to sell your house. So the chances of us closing in a 45 or 60-day window are probably pretty slim, right? Because ultimately, all we're doing now is waiting. Now I'm waiting for you to sell your house so I can wait for you to finish selling my house. It doesn't make, or buying my house. It doesn't make sense. Okay. It just doesn't. So as a listing agent, obviously, if you get an offer like that looks like it's not written into, they're not already in escrow, the red flag, right? The next one is I am only contingent on entering into a contract. I mean, I don't care if we close. I just got to get an escrow. Well, nobody's going to do that because you need to close to be able to get the money to be able to purchase the up leg. So that's not very common that we would do just be. But if I've already entered into escrow, I've already accepted an offer. I already did the marketing. I got a buyer. I was able to do that. I got into escrow. I know when we have a close date. Then I can check off C. And the only contingency we have here is the close of escrow of my property, which is already an escrow with, and it's the escrow company's name, the escrow number, and a copy of the contract for the sale of buyer's property, and the contact information and escrow number for that sale is attached to the COP. Or if you haven't done that, it'll be delivered within 2 days after the acceptance, right? Because this is if, we're doing that. I have to get in a contract and all that stuff. So you don't need to check that box because you should have all that stuff and you send it with your COP. Again, strength of offer. We're writing the right offer. Okay. So I send them the escrow instructions. I send them a copy of the escrow number, the name of the escrow company, the contact information for my escrow officer, and a copy of the contract. Okay. I send that to them. Questions? Any questions so far? Okay. So let's keep going. Now we look at paragraph 2. If buyer is entering into a contract for sale of buyer's property, right? So this is only if you've checked off, if you're going by the default, which is 1A, or you've checked off B. Okay. Buyer has 17 days after acceptance to get the property into escrow by either the time specified in 2A, 17 days, or within 2 days after buyer entering into contract for sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to seller and escrow holder, which means, okay, so if my contingency now says I have to sell it, then what they want is I have 17 days to get it into escrow. And in that 17 days, I have also got to send them by default, right? In that 17 days, I got to send them the copy, or at least within 2 days of entering into that contract. Okay. So I still have to give them the proof of the escrow, the proof of the acceptance. All right. This is the information about the property, right? So I have to put the listing in the MLS status. The buyer has signed a listing agreement for buyer's property, or within 3 days will, with the listing brokerage. That's us, if that's who we are. If we're not the listing brokerage, because I see it where we have, we're representing them as buyers, but somewhere else, out of state, or Northern California, or in San Diego, or somewhere else where they've sold the home that we're not representing them, right? So, but we have to put that listing broker in there. Okay. Now, if it's not going to be in the MLS, right, you have to check off the box where it says here, buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in a geographical area where buyer's property is located, or buyer's property will not be submitted to the MLS. You just have to disclose that it is or isn't going to be in the MLS. Buyer shall deliver seller evidence of both listing agreement, if applicable, and the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance, if buyer's property is already listed with the real estate brokerage, or if not already listed within 1 day of listing. So not only do I have to give them a copy of the contract, I have for the purchase, for the sale, I have to give them a copy of the escrow instructions. I have to give them a copy of the MLS printout, and I have to give them a copy of the listing agreement if I have all those things. Okay. I have to provide those to them within 1 day of acceptance. Okay. Questions about those timelines, about the proof, the documents I have to send? Yes,
Not
Joseph.
timeline, but I do have a question.
Yes.
So to reiterate, it's the MLS printout, the contract, and then the escrow instructions.
And the listing agreement.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Close of escrow on buyer's property. If 1A, remember, that's entering into contract and closing escrow, or C is only closing escrow. Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. The scheduled close of escrow of seller's property, or if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property. Once buyer's property closed, buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel the agreement. So the default is I will remove my contingency of sale on the date of the scheduled close of escrow on the seller's property. So it sounds confusing. So basically what they're saying is whatever we said we were supposed to close escrow on this property, right? So I'm writing an offer, and let's say I put a 30-day escrow. So we wrote that offer on May 1st, and here it is time for us to close. That's my day to remove the contingency. As listing agent, we don't want that, right? We don't want that at all. So we got to do, but no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close, no later than that. Okay. But the buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel this agreement when the buyer's property closes. So let's say that they never remove this contingency. They don't do it. And it says they're supposed to remove it no later than 5 days prior to our close of escrow date. But they closed escrow 10 days ago. Once that escrow closes, whether they've sent us a contingency removal or not, the buyer can't use this contingency of close to cancel. So again, let me repeat. If the buyer still has the contingency in place, they didn't remove it, and they close escrow, they cannot cancel for the buyer's contingency of closing escrow on the prior sale, right? Because they closed, so you can't use it anymore. I would, as a listing agent, I would always want to check this box of no later than 5 days, which means that our scheduled close, let's say, is tomorrow or is Tuesday of next week, right? So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday is day 5, right? It's Tuesday of next week. Even if their escrow hasn't closed yet, but it's close, I have this 5 days prior to our scheduled close of escrow. Doesn't mean I won't give them an extension, but our scheduled close of escrow right now is next Tuesday, June 6th. So I would send them a notice to perform to remove their contingency. If they didn't, then I would have the right to cancel as seller. If they do, then that contingency is gone, whether that escrow closes or doesn't close. Okay. So we have to understand how to protect our sellers in cases like this. So at 5 days prior, even if I have to give them an extension because that one hasn't closed yet, then I will give them the extension, but after they remove the contingency. If they've already closed, this contingency removal doesn't matter because they can't use that as a cancellation reason any longer. Okay. Questions about the close of escrow on buyer's property? Any questions? Yeah, Joseph, go ahead. You're muted, Joseph.
So the close of escrow, the close of escrow cancels it, like where they can't back out, and so does having them remove the contingencies, even if they haven't closed their escrow. So that's 2 ways.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Next up, status of sale of buyer's property. Buyer agrees to keep seller informed about the status of the transaction for the sale of buyer's property, including any changes, modifications, addenda, or amendments to the terms of the accepted offer, or delays to or removal contingency or of removals of contingencies. So I have to tell the seller everything about my downleg. And I think ultimately that becomes one of the things that the listing agents, when they have these contingent sales, they don't really pay attention to, that they're supposed to be kept up on everything. As a buyer's agent, any term I change, if there's any amendments, if there's any addenda, if there's any change in terms, if there's a delay in the removal of contingencies, I have to, within the time, I have to let the listing agent know, hey, listen, they're late on their contingency removals. So as listing agent on the up leg, on the sale, on the purchase of the property they're purchasing, I should be the ones like, hey, your contingencies are up on this day because I have a copy of the contract. Have they removed the contingencies? Have you sent notices to perform? Have you done any of these things? Okay. Within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies in the contract for sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of the removal of those identified contingencies. So I have to show the seller proof that the buyer on my property that I'm the seller on has removed all the contingencies. Any contingency that's in the contract, I have to show the seller proof within 2 days of them removing that contingency. Okay. I have to share that information with the seller on the uplink. If I don't do it, because this 2 days right here of this written request, because it has a time limit on it, it becomes a notice to perform, and then the seller can cancel on me if I don't provide it. The cancellation of buyer's property. If the buyer's property is in or enters escrow and either party of that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation of contract, buyer within 2 days thereafter shall deliver to seller written notice of that cancellation. We have to tell them if it canceled. The reason that I think that's important is because I see so many transactions where the buyer is contingent, right, on selling a property. They're in escrow on an upleg. Their downleg cancels and they don't tell the listing agent on their upleg. And so it's okay, I have a backup offer. I'm going to enter escrow this one's going to close on this time. Yeah, but that's not fair. And that's not what the contract stated for the seller on the upleg. And if the seller finds out that you didn't disclose that cancellation to them and change seller, they don't have to continue with you. They can send cancellation instructions because you're now in breach of the contract. So it's much, much better to be honest and fair and have good communication with the listing agent and let them know when you're having trouble. Hey, here's the deal. We're coming up on contingency periods. I haven't been able to talk with the buyer's agent on the sale of my property. We're having issues with them. I think we're going to have a problem, but I have 3 other backup offers that are ready to go. Are you guys going to be okay with us canceling this one, going with a backup offer and continuing with you because the backup offers are already ready to go. They're going to close in a shorter time than our original buyer was. You have to tell them the truth because they might say no. And then you know where you are, you know what position you're in. Hey, these buyers screwed us up. We have to cancel this sale of our home, which means we have to cancel the purchase of our home. And we have the right to do that because we have this contingency in place. Or because you're honest with them and you've been in good communication and you've sent them everything you were supposed to. Maybe they say, okay, we'll give you some extra time. We'll give you an extension. We'll go ahead and amend the agreement to say that we're going to give you, we're going to accept this other offer and let you have the time to close this escrow. But we're so afraid to have a communication with the listing agent that we just hide it from them and hope that we can slip it past. And then what we do is, we've put ourselves in a position where we don't have a contingency to protect us anymore. They cancel on us. They think we've lied and we've breached the contract and they try to fight for our deposit. And now we have our buyer's deposit stuck. Plus we have their, they've lost their escrow on their downlink. So our buyers don't become super happy with us when we're not handling things the proper way, right? Our buyers/sellers. So we have to make sure that we're disclosing that information to them. Questions? All right. Backup offers and seller's right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. So the backup offers. After this acceptance, the seller has the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that brokers shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. I'm glad that's in there because what that means is this. If I have an offer accepted, whether it's contingent or non-contingent, and I leave my property as active in the MLS, that is a violation. Okay. It has to be active under contract in the MLS. You have to be able to state that it's not that it is for backup offers, not that it is solely active, because it may not be the buyer that you're in escrow with, but one of these buyer's agents that's going to attempt to write an offer or call you about the property. They're going to say, hey, we want to submit an offer. And you're going to say, oh yeah, well, we're in escrow already. This is for backups. And they're going to report you to the board and it's going to be a violation. So just follow the rules of the board. And what the rules say is if you're already under contract, whether that be contingent or not, you put it as active under contract so that everybody knows that they're now there shopping and submitting on backup offers only. Okay. Removal of buyer's contingencies and proof of funds. Unless paragraph 7C3 is selected, and we'll get to 7C3 in a moment. If seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in paragraph 7C1, right? We're going to get to that in a minute. Or seller shall have the right to give written notice to buyer in writing to remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency if one existed, and to provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. Seller may use the bottom of page 2 of this form to comply with this written notice requirement of this paragraph. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. So by default, when we get to 7C and we're talking about the timelines to be able to give this to them, the default is I, as seller, have the immediate right to notify the buyer. So I am listing agent, seller. I accept your contingent offer today. I put it on the MLS. I change the status to active under contract. Tomorrow, I get a phone call from a buyer that says, we just saw your property that was active under contract, and we want to submit an offer. And they submit an offer, and I like that offer better than I like yours. Maybe it's non-contingent, maybe it's more money, doesn't matter. I like it better. I send you the bottom of page 2 of this form that's giving you a 2-day notice to remove all your contingencies and to show me proof of funds to close. If you can't do that in 2 days, I get to cancel and move on with my next buyer. Now, obviously, as the buyer's agent, we don't want immediate right to notify. That doesn't work for us, right? Because we know the process. What we do want, what gives us a balance between having the rug pulled out from under us within a day or two of getting our offer accepted, is number 2, the delayed right to notify buyer. Now, the default on that is 17 days after acceptance. If I've already entered into escrow on my downlink and then I find this property, the chances are those 17 days that I have to remove this contingency of sale, right? The chances are that before I have to remove that contingency, my buyers already removed their contingencies or should have removed their contingencies because they've already started their timelines. They've already done their inspections. I've already given them disclosures. They've already done their appraisal. Everything's going on. My loan contingency is 17 days after this acceptance. So I should feel comfortable being able to remove the loan contingency. I'm removing the contingency of sale because I know that this deal is going to close. So I feel comfortable and confident that I could close this escrow because I've done that. So 17 days should be enough if you've already put the property in escrow prior to writing your offer and getting this offer accepted. If you haven't, then you're going to need more time. Okay. So you got to balance that. The third one, which I don't think any listing agent is going to let slip past, is no right to notify buyer. Seller shall not have the right to invoke the provision of paragraph 7B during the entire term of the agreement. I don't think any seller is going to allow you to do that. Okay. Questions about the contingencies?
So as a listing agent, one would be the strongest.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the most beneficial to your seller is number one, where at any time I can notify you like, hey, we got a better offer and this is it.
Oh, perfect.
But realistically, 17 is, C2 is probably going to be your most common. But if you're a listing agent and that's what you want to do, as I want to have the immediate right to notify. Now, if I were entertaining the idea of accepting an offer where the buyers haven't been put in escrow yet, right, where they haven't sold their house yet, I would be inclined to leave it as a default immediate right to notify. Because why do I want to be on the market for months and months waiting for you to sell your house? I don't. So I might do immediate right to notify in that case. In any other case, if they're already in escrow, I'm going to be accepting of the idea of delayed right to notify. But again, it's all based on your business model, what you want to do, what you feel is the strength of your listing. If you have multiple offers and only one of them is contingent, whether it is good or whether it's competitive but contingent, then maybe that's what you want to leave it as, the immediate right to notify. So it gives people the same benefit as accepting one of the non-contingent buyers. But those are all choices. Just stay away from C3. That's all I would say, as both buyer or listing agent, that you got to run from those, right? This contingency can only be removed in writing, even if buyer removes this contingency, unless buyer also performs all actions pursuant to 7B. Seller retains the right to cancel under paragraph 9. So keep in mind that technically part of that is I have to show you proof of funds when I remove that contingency. Most of the time, once you remove the contingency, they're usually pretty good with it because you've now put your deposit in jeopardy. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But technically, yes, a seller could still cancel if you can't show proof of funds without selling the property. Okay. Here's seller's right to cancel. After first giving buyer a written notice to perform, buyer can buyer written notice to remove buyer contingencies and provide proof of funds below. If buyer fails to take all actions specified in paragraph 7B, they can cancel. After first giving buyer an NBP, notice the buyer to perform. If buyer fails to enter into contract for sale of buyer's property within the type specified in 2A, seller can cancel. After first giving buyer an NBP, if buyer fails to close escrow for the sale of buyer's property in the time specified in paragraph 4, I can cancel. After first giving buyer an NBP, if buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence with the time specified in paragraph 1C or 2B, the seller can cancel. If buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies in the sale of buyer's property as specified in paragraph 5B, if buyer gives notice to seller of either party's cancellation of contract for buyer's property. So if you notice with these last two, there's no notice to perform. I just have the right to cancel. I don't have to give you notice to perform if you didn't deliver the removal of contingencies to me. I don't have to give you notice to perform if you don't notify me of the cancellation. Once you notify me of the cancellation, I can cancel. I don't have to give you a notice to perform. So keep that in mind. Buyer's right to cancel. Pretty straightforward. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal of the buyer's property contingency specified in 1A, B, or C is applicable. If 1A or 1B applies, buyer is unable to enter into a contract on buyer's property within the time specified in 2A. Or if 1A or 1C applies, either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract for purchase of buyer's property. Or if 1A or 1C applies, buyer is unable to close escrow on buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. That's it. I can cancel as buyer. Pretty straightforward. Time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer deposit. This is the one we have to pay attention to. Contract obligations other than the deposit. That means your contingency periods, your time periods for investigations, things like that. Time periods in this agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall begin as specified in the agreement. That's the default. Or if this box is checked, on the day after buyer delivers to seller any of the following: escrow evidence for buyer's property, buyer's election in writing signed by buyer to begin time periods, or buyer's removal of this contingency for the sale of buyer's property. So 3 things trigger it if you've got that box checked. The minute I give the escrow evidence for buyer's property. Okay. So let's say that if I'm trying to be sneaky as a buyer's agent and I check this box to say, well, now my contingency periods on my up leg don't start until I remove my contingency, because that used to be the case. It was start when the contingency is removed. Now it's the escrow evidence for buyer's property. So if I don't check that box that says it doesn't start with the acceptance like a normal contract would, but then I follow the terms of it and say, oh, I've already sold my house, so here's my escrow evidence for the sale of that property, the transaction, the time period start ticking the minute you deliver that, the next day. So you're not going to get one over. But if I'm listing agent, I am not accepting one with this checked. I want the time periods to start. That's it. I want the time periods to start. Okay. Now the next one is the buyer's deposit. The buyer's deposit by default is it's going to follow what the agreement says, the purchase agreement, which is in 3 business days within 3 business days of acceptance of the contract. If they check this box, it's 3 business days after we deliver the escrow evidence, the election to start the time periods, or we remove the contingency. So again, we don't want to check that box. We want their money in. Okay. The buyer signs it, the seller signs it. This is the section that the seller can use as a notice to perform, basically, for them to remove the contingencies that are contained within this addendum. Okay. So that's what they would do. They would sign it and date it and send it over to the buyer. And that would basically be their notice, like, hey, you've got 2 days to do what you need to do in order for us to stay in escrow. Okay. Questions about the COP?
I mean,
Go
I'm
ahead.
just gonna repeat it, but it's so that basically makes it easier instead of coming up with another form, the notice to remove buyer's contingencies.
Yeah.
It would be fully executed when you guys go into contract from the buyer seller. So the second one on the bottom is just
This one is, yeah, that one is going to stay blank until the seller's using it as the notice to perform.
clear. Thank you.
Uh-huh. All right. So that's contingent sales. If you guys feel uncomfortable about the idea of a contingent sale, you got to come see me. You got to talk to me so I can kind of help you walk through it if you've never done one before. But again, you're going to see them. Those are more common than, I'm selling my house and I'm moving out. And, especially with, for people who are selling a home now, the limited amount of inventory, those people are usually wanting to move into something else. So you've got to be prepared for how to do a COP, and then also how to do the SPRP, the seller's purchase of replacement property form, and how you make those contingencies work together. Okay. All right, let's move on. Paragraph 3M1, time of possession. Okay. Possession is not occupancy. Possession and occupancy are 2 different things. Possession is just when I become the owner. Okay. Time of possession upon notice of recordation. Right. That just means that by default, as soon as we get the confirmation that it recorded, you have possession. That's your property. Okay. Or you could check a box that says at 6 p.m. or blank AM or PM on a date specified. as applicable in 3M2 or attached TOPA. Okay. 3M2 is the next paragraph, which is seller occupied vacant units, right? Seller occupied or vacant units. If they're vacant, close of escrow date is when I'm going to be able to occupy it. Or if checked below X amount of days after close of escrow. That's what COE is. So if I check the top box, this is going to be anywhere between 1 and 29 days in this top box. If I stay for 1 day, I put 1 day here. If I stay for 10 days, I put 10 days here. If I want to stay for 29, I put 29 here. The difference is the forms that you use. If the seller is going to remain in one of the units or in the property itself, right, the single family home, and they're going to stay for 29 days or fewer, then you're going to use the SIP, the seller's license to remain in possession. If they're going to stay for 30 days or more, then you will use the RLAS, which is the residential lease after sale. But either way, that's determined right here. How many days are they going to stay? Now, I have this conversation over and over again with buyer's agents, and it comes up because we get close to the close of escrow and the seller hasn't moved out yet. You guys have to understand by default, if there is a seller in the property, I don't care if when you guys show it, there's a sign up that says we'll be out by the close of escrow. You always give a minimum of 3 days after close of escrow if a seller is in possession, right? If the seller is occupying the property, you're going to give them 3 days after close of escrow to give them time to move at a minimum. And you're going to include the SIP, and you're going to give them those 3 days for free. And you're going to build some things into the SIP, maybe a holdover if they stay longer than those 3 days. But at a minimum, you're giving them 3 days. If this is a contingent sale, like we were just talking about previously, where the seller is finding a replacement property, then you're going to probably have to give them a minimum of 7 to 10 days for free. And again, we're talking about how we do strength of offer, and also how we keep a good relationship with our buyer, because we as buyer's agents, and I don't know why this still continues, we've got this crazy idea that, hey, I got my offer accepted with the sellers being out on the close of escrow, right? The default, not putting anything into the seller occupied units, not changing anything on the time of possession, just leaving it by default, meaning that it's mine when we record and you guys should be able to have your keys that day. We do that. And we tell our buyers, like, hey, you're going to get it on the close of escrow. And 99% of the time, that doesn't happen. And the only one that really causes an issue for is us, because you can't evict the seller. The seller's going to be there. If the seller doesn't move out and you want to get money from the seller, well, then your buyer's going to have to go to small claims court and try to sue them for money if they haven't agreed to pay it. So really, the one that's going to hurt is you, because your buyers are going to blame you that they're not able to move in. So please, just know, from now on, I don't care if the seller tells you to your face, I'm going to be out. Don't worry. I'll be out before you do your final walkthrough. I don't care. You give them at least 3 days after close of escrow. It will solve so many headaches for you guys. I just had a conversation, either, I think it was over the weekend. It was early or towards the end of last week. The sellers haven't moved out yet. They didn't pack. What do we do? I said, well, what did you have in your contract? Well, it said on the close of escrow. Did you write it that way? Yes. They didn't counter you. No. You have to be prepared. So his buyers were pissed. They want him out. They have to do this. They want to do that. Hey, you didn't put anything into the contract to, number one, protect them if the seller stayed in, which you should at least request. Whether you get it or not, you have to make the request, right? Of, hey, if seller remains in possession past close of escrow, seller agrees to pay X amount of dollars, right? At least make the request. The seller doesn't have to accept it once you're accepted, but at least make the request so your buyers know that you're working for them. Number two, the reason you made a mistake is because you allowed yourself to believe that a seller was going to be out on the date of close of escrow. And number three, if you had done your walkthrough when you're supposed to 5 days prior, you'd see that they're not moving. And you'd be able to make arrangements at that time instead of on the date it recorded when everybody's frantic and now your buyers are pissed off at you. So you guys have to be smarter about it too. Know that you're not getting a house on the date of close of escrow. Unless that house is vacant right now, you're not getting it on the day you close escrow, vacant. So you got to build it in. You've got to be smarter than that. And you got to build it in and give them at least the 3 days. And if you go and do your walkthrough 5 days prior, like you're supposed to, and it looks like nobody's packed a thing, then you got to say, oh, wait a minute. Listing agent, are these people going to be out on time? Do they need more time? Do we start to need to negotiate it now before we sign docs and do some things? Because my buyer's not, they want to move into their house as soon as they possibly can. Do we need to make some adjustments? But we don't do our walkthrough in the day until the day we record or the day before. So we don't know that there's a problem until it's too late. We don't make concessions for the idea that sellers do need time to move. And a lot of times the people that are in possession of those properties, the sellers, they can't move until they have their money. Or if they're contingent and they're buying a replacement property, they can't move until they're able to close escrow on that up leg. And that up leg might have 3 or 4 or 7 or 10 days in possession for that seller. So you've got to be prepared for that, and you've got to prepare your buyers for that. So please take this paragraph 3M2 way more seriously when you have sellers in possession of a property. When they're occupants of a property that you're selling, you got to know, you got to give them the time. It's important. It's going to save you guys a lot of headaches later. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yes. So you as a buyer's agent, you recommend always giving them 3 by default if they're in possession.
If they live in the property, by default, a minimum of 3 days.
And then, so you would just fill out the SIP and then communicate that to your buyer that that's what we're gonna write the offer at.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. You got to do it because it's in their best interest. Hey, listen, you got to understand is that they're probably not going to be able to move out. So we've got to make considerations for that. And what happens is we make those considerations so it makes things easier for you, because if you're renting and you've got to give notice and move out, you need to know, right? You can't assume. And that's what happens is we as buyers agents, we think, we got one over on the seller. They got to be out when we close. And then so our buyers think that too. And then they give notice and they don't have a place to live. And then it just becomes hectic and crazy. So do yourself a favor and just buy yourself some time. Give them a minimum of 3 days. Give them that minimum. I'm telling you, I'd probably give a minimum of 7 for everything and probably do a minimum of 10 for a contingent sale. That's just my opinion. Okay. Occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. That's a really important thing to read, that it says anyone other than the seller. I had a conversation yesterday with 2 agents that are buying a property that is a probate. And in that probate, the administrator of the probate is living in the property, but they were never one of the owners, obviously, because it's going through a probate. So that administrator is living in the property, and the listing agent was saying, oh, well, we want to give them, 60 days. The seller, they want to do seller in possession for 60 days after close of escrow. I had to remind our buyers that that guy is not the seller. He is anyone other than the seller, because the seller is an entity. It's an estate. Just because he's the administrator, he doesn't now inherit seller's rights as an occupant. He is a tenant for all intents and purposes. And if they close escrow with that man in possession, whether he says he's leaving in 30, 60, or 90 days, if he doesn't want to leave, he becomes their burden, their buyer's burden. They are now responsible for him as a tenant, which means they'd have to pay the money to evict him. They'd have to deal with all of that, however long it took, getting no rents. So you've got to treat family members who are not renters or that are adults that live in a property that are not on the title. You got to treat them as tenants. If I'm selling somebody's house and they say, oh, but my nephew, he rents the extra room from us. That guy's a tenant, and you got to treat him as a tenant. Even if he doesn't pay rent, he's just a nephew that lives there. You got to treat him as a tenant, because I've had history in the past. It's happened to me. And I know that it's happened to many other agents where, elderly sellers have grown children that live in the house with them, and those grown children refuse to move because their mom or dad is not giving them enough money, right? For them to move out too. They're not taking care of them.
Kyle,
Yes, Angel.
will this paragraph be the same in the probate purchase agreement?
There is no,
Like
there
in your
isn't
case?
one. It's just this one with the probate addendum. So it's the same. It's the
Okay.
same purchase agreement. And if you're using if you're talking about units, right? Because since we're talking about tenants here, occupied units by tenants,
Uh,
if you're writing an offer on units, This paragraph doesn't exist in the residential income purchase agreement. So if you're using the residential income purchase agreement, you don't have to worry about this section at all. Okay. So if you're writing an offer on units, even though this purchase agreement is legal up to 4 units, please, if it's 2 units
Or more.
use the residential income. Okay.
Okay.
Now, this tenant occupied property addendum, we've got to supply it even if the tenant is going to move out. This is only about, is it stating that, yes, there is a tenant occupied unit or property at the moment, not whether they're staying, not whether they're moving. It doesn't dictate. This is not that. Like if they're leaving, people always tell me, well, I don't have to do it because the tenant's moving out. Yes, you do. Even if the tenant's going to move out, you still got to include this TOPA. If the tenant's staying, you include the TOPA, and it gives you some information about the tenant remaining in possession, like, are you going to get estoppels, things like that. And somebody's asking you, do we need to get an estoppel on an estate sale if the administrator lives there? There is no estoppel because that administrator is not paying any rent. There's nothing for them to verify, right? Estoppels verify the rent payments, their security deposit, their lease length, things like that. So no, you don't get estoppels on that, but you still have to treat them like a tenant, right? You can't let those people stay in possession of the property at close of escrow. It can't happen because even though they're not technically a tenant, they inherit tenant's rights once you do that. Okay. So the TOPA, the tenant occupied property addendum, has to be included with your offer if there is a tenant in the property, even if that tenant will be out at close of escrow. Fair? Any other questions about this, about possession? Any question? No? All right. Quickly, we'll do the seller's timelines here before we finish for the day. This 3N, paragraph 3N, is all about the documents and the disclosures that the seller has to provide now. These explanation paragraphs, 14A, 19B, 11K, 10B, 28, that'll give us a real detailed list of what those documents are. And we'll get to that when we get to those paragraphs, but it'll give us a list. So if you ever want to know what documents have to be delivered within 7 days of acceptance, they're listed. Okay. You got to sign and return the escrow holder provisions and instructions in 5 days. That's for both parties, right? So when we get them, we have 5 days to sign them and return them to escrow. The delivery of documents, the default for the seller is 7 days after acceptance. I have 7 days after acceptance as a seller to provide all documents that I'm required to. That means all disclosures, any reports I have, all the information. That means pre-sale and city inspection reports. That means 9A report. That means certificate of compliance. Any of those things I'm required to provide in the first 7 days. So what that should tell you is if I'm working within a city like Compton, Southgate, Huntington Park, Linwood, or whatever, Compton, any of those cities that require pre-sale inspections, I need to make sure I'm ordering these pre-sale inspections prior to getting an offer accepted, or I have to give the buyer more time on their inspection and investigation contingency because they're not going to have them in 7 days. They're not. In most places, it's 2 weeks. Unless you want to pay extra, you pay extra and you can get it back faster. But it's usually, for sure, it's Southgate. It's 2 weeks to get somebody to go out and 2 weeks to get the report back. So you're talking about a month. You're talking about your whole escrow period if you're waiting for offers to get accepted before you're ordering. So guys, as listing agents, do the right thing. Talk to your sellers, explain to your sellers how it works and what it does for them as far as a transaction goes, and get those reports ordered immediately. Order the NHD report as soon as you can. Order the prelim as soon as you can. And talk to the seller about what they do have. If the seller has done a termite inspection in the past, great. Use that as part of your disclosures. If the seller has an appraisal for whatever reason, great, part of your disclosures. Any reports that the seller has, I'm required to turn over. If there was a prior escrow, and that escrow canceled, and I have a copy of the home inspection report from the first buyer, guess what I have to do? Include that in my disclosures. And the benefit for me as seller is if I attach that inspection report from a previous buyer to my disclosures, it just strengthens my disclosures. But I have to have all that stuff ready as soon as possible because by default, I got 7 days to give all of that to the buyer after we're accepted. Okay. And anytime I start delaying that, I'm putting at risk that I'm delaying their necessity to remove their contingencies. Okay. And I'm delaying the escrow. That's what I'm doing. Okay. So get that done as soon as possible. The time to pay fees for ordinary HOA documents, it says 3 days after acceptance. That's a little tough because generally escrow orders that and they don't order it until they get the deposit in. So chances are it's going to be, 3 to 6 days before those get ordered, but just understand that. The smoke detectors and water heater bracing, that's supposed to be done within 7 days of acceptance. Okay. Now, if the seller's going to be responsible for that, which 99% of the time they are, if they don't have it done in the first 7 days and the appraiser comes out and sees it and says, oh no, we need smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors and the water heater's not braced, and that becomes part of the appraisal, then the appraiser has to come back out to re-inspect the property to see that those things were done. If there is a re-inspection fee, the contract now makes the seller responsible for that re-inspection fee. So again, if we know that there's no smoke alarms, there's no carbon monoxide detectors, and the water heater's not braced, as I take the listing and I do my walk around before I start marketing it, maybe that's something as listing agents we want to think about, like, hey, let's get that done before we market it so that we're not having any time constraint issues with that 7 days. Okay. And if there is a representative capacity, meaning this is an entity and I'm a representative of that entity signing on behalf of the entity, like a probate, like a corporation, like a trust, I have 3 days after acceptance to show proof of my authority to sign on behalf of that entity. Okay. I have to give that to the buyer. I have to give that to the seller if I, as buyer, am an entity. Okay. So we'll stop there for today. Questions about what we just talked about, these documents, fees, and compliance timelines in paragraph 3N. Anybody? Okay. All right. So that should do it for that. And we will continue next Thursday. So any questions before I let you guys go on anything? Anybody?
No, just compliment. That was great.
Thanks, Joseph. I appreciate it. Anybody else? I got a thumbs up from Mel over there. Okay, I got 2 people.
So the TOPA, can I add that after like our offer has been, because we have it's a probate sale and we've gone through like all the inspections and stuff like that, but there is the what is it, the
Administrator?
Yeah, the administrator is living in the property, but I did not include it, the TOPA. Can I do it now?
It is well, you should, but it's not in there. So, I understand if the listing agent gives you a hard time about it, but it should be included. Is the administrator, is their plan to be out prior to close? Like, you're not negotiating for them to remain in possession or anything, right?
No, she said that they were going to move out at the close of escrow.
Yeah, I would still maybe try to at least send it to the seller and see if they're the listing agent and see if they're willing to accept the TOPA. It's just stating that they're technically a tenant living in the property.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Somebody else had a question, I thought.
Me,
Yeah,
Kyle.
Go ahead.
It's kind of related. So you know how if you do a request for repair and you put like if you, after escrow you leave a certain amount in escrow if they don't finish the repairs?
Okay.
What happens to the money if they never do the repairs?
Okay. So there's a couple things that have to happen. Number one is if there's money that's being left in escrow, it can't be made payable to the buyer because the lender's probably going to disallow it. Okay. If the money is substantial enough, really what it's there is to be more of a punishment or deterrent to the seller, meaning like if you don't do it, your money's just going to sit there in escrow because that's what'll happen. And it'll sit there for 3 years in escrow. If they don't do what they're supposed to do, then it escheats to the state and there's a whole other problem. What should happen if that's what if the plan is there's going to be money left in escrow to complete repairs, then whoever is the licensed contractor that's doing the repairs, you can have that money payable to that contractor so that when they show proof of the repairs being completed, that money then is released to them and then no lender will have a problem with it. Other than that, unless there's something that gets somehow gets negotiated and is approved by the lender, then that money is just going to sit there until the seller does the repairs. Or if you were able to negotiate some way for the money to go to the buyer because the seller didn't complete the repairs, then the money would get released to the buyer.
Oh,
But
okay.
most of the time, that's a punitive thing that's just held until the seller finishes, and then the money goes back to the seller because it's theirs.
Got it. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Where would you
Mhm.
put that? And what part of the form would you put that the funds be held into an escrow account until the request for repairs are complete?
An amendment of existing agreement terms.
Oh, that's it,
Fine.
simple. Just like seller to hold whatever,
Seller
5,000.
agrees to leave, $5,000 in escrow until repairs are completed. That's
Oh,
it.
perfect. Thank you.
Mhm. Whatever the amount is. But if you're going to do that, make it an amount that's going to hurt that they can't live without. Don't put it like $1,000. Okay. All right. I net, $175,000 from the sale, but $1,000 I'm not going to get because until I do the repairs, there's no motivation there. You got to make it hurt. And that's the thing is if you start requesting larger amounts, the chances are they're going to get the repairs done prior just because they don't want to deal with the nonsense. Okay. Any other questions, guys? Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you guys go. I will see you next Thursday and we'll continue the RPA. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. Have a great day.